If you want to understand the Lockheed Constellation, don't start with the specifications, start with the pilots. One said the airplane flew so well that Lockheed no longer needed him. Another called it very much a flight engineer's airplane. Crews joked about completing flights on only 3 engines, and one veteran pilot eventually called it the king, queen, and prince of the props. Those opinions sound like they describe completely different aircraft. They don't. They all describe the Connie. So why did this airplane inspire equal amounts of admiration, caution, and fear? When the first Constellation was finally ready to fly in January 1943, Lockheed did something revealing. They brought in Eddie Allen. Allen was not actually a Lockheed pilot. He was Boeing's chief test pilot, one of the most experienced men available for evaluating large, complicated aircraft. Lockheed already had Milo Burcham, an exceptional test pilot in his own right, but Burcham had less experience with large 4-engine machines, and the Constellation was unlike almost anything Lockheed had previously built. 4 right radial engines, a pressurized cabin, a huge wing, a distinctive curved fuselage, and dimensions that made the company's earlier transports look small. Nobody yet knew exactly what all of that would feel like once the airplane left the ground. A large aircraft could look elegant from outside and still be miserable at the controls. Heavy, slow to respond, physically exhausting, or worse, unstable in ways that had never appeared during ground testing. So on January 9th, 1943, Allen took the left seat, with Burcham flying alongside him. The prototype lifted from Burbank and began its first real test, and then something unexpected happened. Not much. The airplane behaved. Allen and Burcham exchanged control during the testing. The Connie flew to Muroc Dry Lake. It performed repeated takeoffs and landings. Then, after experiencing the machine Lockheed had been worrying about for years, Allen reportedly gave them one of the best compliments a test pilot could possibly give. That sentence tells us far more than simply saying the first flight was successful. Allen's entire job was to find the unpleasant surprises, to discover what the engineers had missed, feel something strange through the controls, and understand what it meant before it became dangerous. Instead, his reaction suggested that Lockheed had produced a very large aircraft that behaved with remarkable maturity from the beginning. And that impression would follow the Constellation for decades. It looked enormous, it looked complicated, yet pilots repeatedly discovered that once they actually had it in their hands, the aircraft itself could be surprisingly cooperative. But making a giant airplane pleasant to fly was only half of what Lockheed wanted. Howard Hughes wanted it to be fast, very fast. Hughes had been deeply involved in the Constellation project from the beginning. TWA needed something capable of giving it an advantage over its competitors, and Hughes wanted an airliner with the speed, range, and altitude performance to completely change long-distance travel. Then, the Second World War intervened. The Constellations originally intended for civilian airlines were taken into military service as C-69 transports. That could have delayed the airplane's public moment. Instead, Hughes found another way to create one, and they did not present it like an anonymous military transport. The aircraft appeared in TWA colors. That was a very deliberate statement. The Army technically had the airplane, but Hughes wanted everyone looking at it to imagine what would happen after the war. Imagine this aircraft carrying paying passengers. Imagine crossing the country dramatically faster than before. Then Hughes and Fry gave them the number that mattered. The Constellation covered the trip in just under 7 hours. According to TWA's own historical record, the flight took 6 hours and 57 minutes. It established a new cross-country transport record, and Jack Fry later made a revealing comment about it. He essentially argued that they had not needed to deliberately chase a record. The time came because the airplane had simply been designed to fly that fast. That was almost more effective than bragging. Hughes had turned the flight into theater. Fry's reaction made the performance sound routine, and for airline pilots, that combination mattered. The Constellation was not merely beautiful, it could genuinely move. Speed was not what made later pilots speak about it with such affection, because once you actually sat behind the yoke, another surprise appeared. For an aircraft of its size, the Connie could be remarkably pleasant to hand fly. Decades after the Constellation had disappeared from normal passenger service, airline pilot John Deakin got an extraordinary opportunity. He was allowed to command a surviving EC-121, a military descendant of the Super Constellation. This was not someone remembering the airplane through nostalgia from a passenger seat. Deakin was an experienced professional pilot actually trying to operate the thing, and the flight did not go perfectly. There were instrument problems, a questionable nose gear indication, hydraulic issues had already complicated preparations. This was an old, complex machine behaving like an old, complex machine. Yet during an instrument approach, Deacon discovered something that sounds almost absurd given the size and age of the aircraft. It was stable. It was easy to fly. That did not mean the cockpit itself was easy. The instrument layout was old-fashioned enough that Deacon complained about building a comfortable scan. But when it came to making the airplane follow the approach, the Connie behaved beautifully. This is an important distinction. An aircraft can be mechanically complicated without having unpleasant flying qualities, and the Constellation was full of systems designed specifically to make a large airplane manageable. Its control system included hydraulic boost. The pilot still moved a conventional yoke and pedals, but hydraulic assistance reduced the physical force required to move the control surfaces. That helped give the Connie an unusually civilized feel for such a large piston aircraft. The airplane could be huge without constantly reminding your arms how huge it was, but there was another side to that sophistication. The more machinery you place between the pilot's input and the final result, the more machinery there is to understand when something stops behaving normally. And the deeper pilots got into the Connie, the more obvious something became. Two people holding the flight controls were not operating the aircraft alone. There was another man in the cockpit, and if you wanted to understand whether 4 right radials were happy, he might have been the most important man on board. If you're enjoying this video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel and helps more people discover these aviation stories. On a modern airliner, we tend to imagine the captain and first officer as controlling almost everything from 2 seats at the front. The Constellation belonged to a different era. Behind the pilot sat the flight engineer, and his workstation looked almost like a completely separate cockpit. Gauges, switches, fuel controls, electrical systems, engine temperatures, oil systems, mixtures, cooling, 4 enormous piston engines, each with its own collection of things that could become unhappy. The pilots could point the aircraft toward Paris. The engineer had to help make sure the machinery kept running long enough to get there. John Deacon understood this almost immediately. Before his historic flight, the FAA had been particularly concerned about finding someone properly qualified for the flight engineer position. He then joked that almost anyone could fly it. Operating that engineer's panel was another matter entirely. You can see why during takeoff, Deacon initially advanced the throttles himself. Then, partway through the power application, he called for the engineer to take them. From there, the flight engineer brought the engines precisely up to the required manifold pressure and balanced them. And there was a very practical reason for dividing the workload. The pilots could not even see most of the detailed engine information. Deacon pointed out that the main panel in front was almost strangely empty of engine instruments. Manifold pressure and RPM were visible. Much of everything else lived behind them. The flight engineer knew what the engines were doing. He watched the fuel, he watched temperatures, he watched the systems. He could see a problem developing before the pilots necessarily knew one existed. During Deacon's takeoff briefing, he even gave the engineer authority to pull the power below a certain speed if the engineer saw something serious. Think about that for a moment. The captain is holding the airplane straight. The runway is disappearing beneath them. 4 engines are accelerating more than 100,000 pounds of aircraft. Yet someone behind the captain might recognize the reason to abort before the captain does. That tells you how much trust existed between these crew positions. And that trust was necessary because the 4 engines were both one of the Connie's greatest strengths and the source of some of its most famous stories. The Wright R3350 was an extraordinary machine. 18 cylinders, 2 rows, thousands of horsepower. A huge radial engine designed during an era when manufacturers were extracting astonishing amounts of power from piston technology. It had also developed a difficult reputation. The R3350 had already experienced serious overheating and fire problems during its development for the B-29. By the time it reached later constellations, the engine had been substantially improved. But the fundamental challenge remained. You were producing enormous power from a very complicated air-cooled engine. Temperatures mattered, mixture mattered, cooling mattered, oil mattered. And when something went wrong, crews paid attention immediately. That background helps explain one of the most famous jokes attached to the Constellation. The Connie was sometimes called the world's finest 3-engine airliner. There are versions of the line all over aviation history, and I would be cautious about pretending we know exactly which captain said it first. It is best treated as crew folklore, but the joke survived because everyone understood it. The airplane had 4 engines. Crews joked as though arriving with all 4 still operating was almost an unnecessary unnecessary luxury. The reality was obviously less dramatic than the joke. Constellations routinely completed perfectly normal flights on 4 engines, but piston engines of this size demanded far more attention than modern turbine engines, and engine shutdowns were a recognized part of airline operations. Robert N. Buck experienced the more frightening version. Buck spent decades flying for TWA and eventually became one of the airline's chief pilots. In his memoir, he remembered taking off from Frankfurt in a Constellation after already having spent roughly 30 years as a captain. Just after the aircraft left the ground, an engine fire warning appeared. The crew reacted immediately. Throttle closed, fuel cut, fire extinguisher activated, checklist. Those were the trained actions. But Buck's mind was already thinking beyond the checklist. He feared what an uncontrolled fire might do to the wing. So instead of treating the situation like a calm exercise in 4-engine redundancy, he turned back aggressively. The entire flight lasted only a few minutes. They landed safely, and the fire had been extinguished by the time they reached the ground. Buck's story explains why the 3-engine joke was funny to crews. Flying on 3 engines was not necessarily the terrifying part. The Connie had been designed to survive an engine failure. The question was, what was happening inside the failed engine? Was it simply no longer producing power, or was something still tearing itself apart, still leaking, still burning? Because on the later Super Constellations, the engines became more powerful by adding even more machinery to the equation. The final generations of large piston airliners existed in a strange technological moment. Jets were coming, but engineers were still finding extraordinary ways to extract more performance from piston engines. The Super Constellations' later Wright R3350s used one of the most impressive examples: power recovery turbines. There were 3 of them on each turbo-compound engine. Normally, enormous amounts of energy leave a piston engine through the exhaust. The engineers looked at that hot, fast-moving gas and thought, why waste it? So the exhaust was directed through small turbines. Those turbines captured energy and mechanically fed some of it back into the crankshaft. The result was hundreds of additional horsepower without simply making the basic piston engine dramatically larger. It was brilliant. It also meant that behind each engine were extremely fast-moving turbines operating in brutal conditions, and aviation crews did what aviation crews have always done when confronted with brilliant but temperamental machinery. They made jokes about it. PRT officially meant power recovery turbine. Deakin understood the humor very quickly. Before another Connie flight, he personally checked the turbines by reaching into the exhaust system and spinning them. One did not feel right. There was resistance, a scraping sensation. The flight stopped there. The engine was opened up for inspection. Deakin later reflected that finding the problem had permanently convinced him never to skip that check, because that kind of condition could lead to a turbine fire. And here is where 2 pilot stories suddenly connect. Remember Robert Buck's engine fire leaving Frankfurt? After the aircraft was safely back on the ground, Buck learned that the cause involved a complicated turbine that had failed and damaged things around it. 2 pilots, 2 completely different eras. One operating the Connie as a working TWA airliner, another trying to preserve one decades later, both telling stories that point toward the same truth. The Super Constellation was an engineering masterpiece, but masterpieces can still contain parts that make experienced pilots nervous, and this creates the biggest contradiction in the entire story. Because after hearing all of this, you might expect pilots to describe the Connie as an exhausting relic, beautiful from outside, interesting historically, but something they were relieved not to fly anymore. John Deakin felt almost exactly the opposite. And if you enjoy stories like this, please consider subscribing. My goal right now is to reach 100 subscribers, and every single subscription helps me get closer. By the time Deakin finally got the opportunity to command a Connie in 1999, the airplane belonged to another age. Jets had replaced it decades earlier. Modern airliners were faster, more economical, more reliable, far less dependent on a flight engineer constantly nursing 4 giant piston engines. Deakin knew all of that. In fact, he openly admitted that jets had beaten the old propeller airliners on the things airlines cared about. Yet his account of finally flying the Constellation reads almost like someone describing a childhood dream coming true. He had watched airplanes like it when he was younger. He had listened to radial engines. Then the jet age arrived, and the great piston airliners faded away before he could experience the Connie in its prime. So when he eventually found himself in command of one, his reaction was anything but detached. He wrote that he could not stop grinning. He described the flight as one of the great achievements of his flying career. That reaction becomes much more meaningful after hearing everything else he said. He was not praising the Connie because he did not understand its flaws. He had seen them firsthand. Before his first flight, there were hydraulic problems. During the flight, the crew dealt with unreliable airspeed information and an unsafe nose gear indication. Before another flight, he found a questionable power recovery turbine. He knew how much work went into the flight engineer's panel. He knew 4 R3350s could become very expensive and very complicated very quickly. And still, he loved the airplane. That may be the best way to understand pilots' opinions of the Constellation. They did not necessarily love it because it was easy in every sense. In some ways, it was extraordinarily demanding. They loved what happened once an entire crew understood how to operate it. The captain flew. The first officer backed him up. The flight engineer managed an orchestra of mechanical systems behind them. 4 huge radial engines produced thousands upon thousands of horsepower. Hydraulic systems helped make an enormous aircraft feel surprisingly civilized through the controls. And when everything came together, the result could be incredibly satisfying. That is why Eddie Allen's reaction after the first flight matters. The airplane itself behaved so well that the test pilot joked that Lockheed no longer needed him. It is why Jack Fry could cross the United States in less than 7 hours and essentially argue that the record came naturally to an aircraft built for speed. It is why Deakin could fly an instrument approach in a massive old piston aircraft and come away impressed by how stable it felt. It is why that same pilot could admit that the Connie was really a flight engineer's airplane. It is why crews could joke about 3 engines while knowing exactly how serious an engine fire could become. And it is why, after all of those complications, Deacon could still climb out of one unable to stop smiling. Maybe that is what modern descriptions of the Constellation sometimes miss. We tend to focus on how it looked, the triple tail, the curved fuselage, the long landing gear, the beautiful polished skin of the classic airline versions. And yes, the Connie was beautiful, but the pilots remembered something passengers could never really see. They remembered what it felt like when the entire machine was working beneath them. They remembered the engines coming up to power, the engineer trimming them, the aircraft beginning to accelerate, then that enormous machine becoming surprisingly light in the pilot's hands. They also remembered watching the gauges, listening for changes, managing temperatures, reacting when a warning light suddenly appeared. The Constellation demanded attention, but it rewarded attention. And perhaps that is why the pilots who understood its problems best could also become the people who loved it the most. The Connie was never a perfect airplane. The pilots themselves make that very clear. It was something more interesting. It was an airplane that could make an experienced test pilot say he was no longer needed, a captain admit how much he depended on the engineer sitting behind him, and generations of crews joke about an engine disappearing along the way. Yet once you gave one of those pilots the chance to fly it again, the complaints suddenly became part of the affection. Because for them, the Lockheed Constellation was not simply something beautiful to look at, it was something you had to operate. And when everything came together, few airplanes made them feel quite the same way.